Welcome everybody to Future Talks. I am Ken Lusinger of Zero North Data, and to the right I have David Hamiton of America's Future Series, and joining us is Cody Willard and their first inaugural guest, Rudyard Lynch.
Well, it's great to be here with you guys. Thank you, Ken, for being our sponsor, Zero North. I'm thrilled to be working with Cody Willard, who has been on Fox and CNBC, et cetera, helping us co-host this program. We had our first episode sort of laying out the foundation of it. But today, we're really thrilled that we have the opportunity to have Rudyard Lynch, someone I'm a big fan of and everyone else is here, join us. And I'd like Cody to say hello, and I'd like Cody to introduce Rudyard if we could.
That's great, and always happy to be here, and trying to make America more noble. What a great idea. Welcome, Rudyard Lynch from Whatifalthist. You guys can find him on YouTube, and I think, frankly, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself? I know that David's probably going to give this raving review and make you sound unbelievable, which is great, but give us a little more refrain in your own.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Rudyard Lynch. I'm a 21-year-old originally from Philadelphia, and I live in Los Angeles now. And I've run this show for about 8 years. I started it on my 13th birthday, mostly out of boredom. And for the first 6 years, I did something called alternate history, which is like, what if the Nazis won World War II? What if the South won the Civil War? And then you figure out what would happen from that. But then through doing alternate history, I figured out a lot of principles that I believe are how history and politics and societies work. And so that's what I do full time now. I have a team behind me, and I make videos about looking at the patterns for why civilizations rise and fall, and then using it to project into the future. And now I can't believe this is my full-time job, but we have like 2 million viewers a month, and it's a great community.
Well, Rudyard, I think I can share why you have 2 million viewers, which is, I would argue, you are the best read human being I've ever met. You have a voracious appetite for information and wisdom. And what I love about what you do is you're able to combine these things, put them together, synthesize them, et cetera, and make sense of them. And for all of us who are not going to read 1,000 books, it's really nice to have someone like you who can be that source that integrates everything. And when I've watched your programs, I've been struck by how you're able to draw parallels and analogies, et cetera. And then, as you said, take this information and project to the future. And so America's Future Series, the group that I run, the speaker series and think tank, its mission is to help make America a stronger, more noble, and more generous country. And we believe that America needs to remain the strongest military, political, and economic power in the world. And we can only do that if we can be competitive globally, that we're innovative, et cetera, right? And one of the cornerstones of this whole program that Cody and I agree on, we jokingly call it peaceful agreement instead of violent agreement, is the need to not be tribal, to be against partisanship. We're very anti-partisan. And I would argue that partisanship is the single existential threat we face. Can't figure out a way to get along, we can't solve the problems, et cetera. So we'd like you to talk a little bit about what you've learned about civilizations, societies, et cetera, and draw some parallels between America. And if you would talk a little bit about your most recent podcast, which is sort of America, the New Rome. And any parallels you can draw between that and your observations, and then any prescriptions for what you think America should do in order to remain the strongest military, political, and economic power in the world, along with its allies. We would love for you to share your insights on that.
Okay. You gave me a lot of stuff to do, but we've got time. So with the cycles of history, there are 3 big ones. There's the smallest one, which is around 80 years, and that's a generational cycle. That's something that Neil Howe and Strauss, I think, made a book about, looking through why you see similar generational trends over time. And for example, in America, in the Anglo-Saxon world in general, we've had political crises roughly every 80 years. We have the current one. 80 years ago, we had World War II. 80 years before that, we had the American Civil War. a little bit more than 80 years before that, there was the Revolution, then the English Civil War, and this is a well-established pattern. Then you have the larger cycles, which are around 300 years. And Peter Turchin is a brilliant historian who's figured this out, and he actually has computer models that he can use to predict when countries will have political or social crises from two metrics, those being average quality of life and the amount of income held by the top 0.1% of the population. And he's able to predict when the Russian Civil War or the fall of the Roman Republic or the Black Death in medieval Europe happened in the years they happened in from using those two metrics. And in 2010, he predicted the 2020s would be a horrible decade in America due to political partisanship, because those two metrics are at a bad place right now in America. And you can see these cycles play out again and again, where the last example of this was the French Revolution in the Western world. There was a more recent version in the non-Western world where like 30 million people died in China in a Christian rebellion, or there was a famine in 1870 that killed more people than World War II that no one hears about. But then before the French Revolution, it was the wars of religion in the 1600s. Then it was the Black Death. And you can see this going back to the Bronze Age. And all of the metrics, I've made like 20 different metrics you can use to predict this stuff. And it contains stuff as weird as average height, average age of marriage. And as a general rule of thumb, I've found when the average age of marriage goes above 28, your society's going to have a social crisis. But then there's the even longer period where a bunch of really respected historians, where this is actually my wall of macro history. So like Quigley's done this, then Amaury de Réaucourt has done this, and you can find really stark similarities over a 2,500 year period between separate civilizations, or a bit over 2,000. And my last video that David brought up is my similarities between the Greco-Roman classical civilization and modern Western civilization. And I spend 40 minutes going through how there are so many uncanny similarities between the Greeks and the Europeans, as well as the Romans and the Americans. And the era that we have the closest parallel to is around 100 BC, where Rome and America are both ethnic amalgam, where like a bunch of different ethnicities mixing together. Then they're superpower republics that drove out the kings and then expanded really rapidly. And for both the Romans and the Americans, and people don't understand this about the Romans, they conquered in order to basically protect their allies and protect their own interests in the same way the American empire was formed to fighting against the Axis or the Soviets. And in both cases, there was a massive period of wealth that came after their two big wars, the World Wars or the Punic Wars. And through that wealth, you started to see the breakdown of their social codes with rising inequality, large corporations taking over large parts of society. You saw decline in traditional values, mass political polarization, and I can go full throttle on this and just talk about the similarities more, but I think that's a good place to start. But the thing that worries me is with both the Romans and the Americans is that what ended up happening with Rome is they had a horrifying political crisis, which resulted in the loss of their democracy, and then them becoming what amounted to a military dictatorship. And then you had all sorts of tyrants like Caligula and Nero and Tiberius, who did some really bad stuff. And so as Americans, I think the onus is upon us to look back to this Roman precedent and keep there from being another Caligula.
Absolutely, right. And one of the things that David and I hit on earlier, and this whole partisanship, and what drives me crazy with the partisan viewpoint is that at this point, it's gotten so tribal that you're pretty sure that the other side, whichever side you're on, the other side is going to become this dictator and overtake our country, and we're not going to have democracy is always under attack here, and et cetera. And certainly I think it is, but it is the partisanship, the fact that if you vote independent, if you write a candidate in, you're going to waste, quote unquote, waste your vote. Now, I would argue that voting for a Republican is wasting your vote because you're not voting for anybody who's conservative if you're doing that. And I might argue that voting for a Democrat is wasting your vote because you're not voting for anybody who's liberal if you're doing that. Liberal Democrats are not liberal. Republicans are not conservative. We've got this, it's, even had Marjorie Taylor Greene arguing that we need a divorce in this country. And you might actually mention that the red states that supposedly are being funded by the blue states and the blue states are being funded by the red states. Here in New Mexico, we have 0 giant corporations based here. You got Intel that's got a factory or 2. There's no major corporations based in New Mexico. 95% of all welfare in this country is given to banks and giant corporations through subsidies, loopholes, outright welfare payments for a Hollywood company.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that the New Mexico citizens in rural New Mexico are actually funding New York City and the giant corporations over there.
It's
you mentioned it. It is this corporatist movement that has overtaken our country. We've got the partisanship. Talk us through some of those parallels and why it is so scary.
There's a couple different things, and I really like that last point you hit on, because there's a term in French called the l'Ancien Régime, and that means the period before the French Revolution. And the thing is that you can draw so many parallels. I don't think we'll have the French Revolution, but there's a lot of parallels across the modern world with China. China's very l'Ancien Régime, but the way the societies were built before the French Revolution is the government had to work with all these elites. And so the government would sell various political offices or privileges to separate elites. And so the economy was cordoned off into all these areas that was owned by private individuals. And the thing that people don't get at the French Revolution is no one was winning. The government was broke, the nobility was broke, but the economy was so inefficient because it was sectioned off by all these weird special interests that it just stopped functioning. And I think you can draw parallels in the modern world between like the medical industry, which is giant and complicated and doesn't really serve anyone. You could go through how we bailed out the banks, but through bailing out the banks, they became attached in an incestuous way to government policy. And we don't have really a fair or good capitalism because of that. And as a YouTuber, YouTube acts like an oligarchic third world nation. They take out my videos on like complete innocuous topics like Southeast Asia. Like my video on Southeast Asian anthropology was taken down. That's how weird they get.
Sensitive
yeah, exactly.
So if I may, Rudyard, you're doing something really important that is root cause, root level discussions. What's important here to me is understanding what drives all of these things. And if we look at the lessons of history, they repeat themselves.
Yeah.
We are here in a situation, in this dysfunctional situation with our country, which it makes sense. It happens over and over again. We're experiencing it again. And if we're not aware of what's driving these things, we're going to repeat them. And part of this gets back to your basic description of how civilizations start, the barbarism to civilization to decadence model. And if you would tie all of this together with regard to that, where we are in that barbarism, decadence, civilization, and then decadence model, where we're at, because all of this makes sense when you understand that model.
Yeah, that's I made a video about this, and the barbarism, civilization, decadence cycle is something people have believed for 2,500 years at least. Herodotus is the first writer we have about it. There's Livy, Machiavelli, Plutarch, and a society that's in its state of barbarism. People are very close to the earth. The society has to keep it really real because people are always fighting against the natural world. And in the Western world, the most recent time we had barbarism was the 15 and 1600s, where there was witch burnings and the conquistadors in Mexico. And these societies are often really brutal and bigoted, but they have vigor. People have kids, they can fight. Then after barbarism comes civilization, where civilization is the period where you can combine that vigor, but also at the same time, you have more rationality, you have more articulation, more self-control. In Europe, this was the 17 and 1800s, the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment. But then after, what happens is that once civilization becomes strong enough that it can protect people from the outside world, people start to fall into decadence. And I have a long video talking about this, but I'll cut it short, where decadence is what happens when people are completely isolated from the real world as it exists, and they're more based upon local status competitions than anything that actually helps the world. People care more about following fashions to make themselves look cool than keeping the military, having the military protect the country, doing science. And then, like, there's some great examples of this, where in China in around 1000 AD, the barbarians were coming down from the north. In the Chinese Sung dynasty, they made poetry at how much they wanted to defeat the barbarians, but they didn't improve their military because that wasn't cool. In India, at the exact same time period, the Afghan and Muslim barbarians were attacking into India. The Indians would lose battles outnumbering the Afghans 10-1. And they, rather than improving their militaries to fight off the Afghans, they built temples to honor the gods, so the gods would grant them victory. And there's so many other examples of this, and this happens in each of the major civilizations. And if you look at the cycles of history, the West started a lot later, and we've been able to keep ourselves vigorous for a much longer period of time through institutions like capitalism, democracy, and all that stuff. And what ends up happening with decadence is a single social class seizes control of the society, and then they hijack it in their own direction. In Islam, it's a combination of the warriors and the priest class. In India, it's the priest class. In China, it's the bureaucrats. In Rome, it was the slave owners in the army. And in the West, it's the managerial class, which is what I call the people with college degrees who work in the government, who work in
giant corporations.
Exactly. And the managerial class, you can look at a lot of different policies, and it's an indirect way of just giving people with college degrees more influence and power. And so what they end up doing is they construct a religion or ideology which justifies why they should ignore the outside world, and it puts the locus of truth in documents in shared documents rather than actually looking at the outside world. And we're seeing that where we've built an ideology, which is in effect secular Christianity. And then we try to make it so that in order to have any progress in society, you have to read the ideological text, be accepted into the current ruling class, and then isolate that for control of society. And what ends up happening is that decadent societies hate things that remind them of the outside world. And they hate
the reality, right? Hard truths.
Yeah. And then what ends up happening is you have a society that doesn't have any progress, where technological progress, where the economy is hijacked for the wealthy, where they can't fight off foreign barbarians. And this is just a pattern you've seen so many times before in history. And the parallel to the civilization we're closest to is the Romans. And we are in the parallel where the Romans became decadent.
So I would agree with that. And what's interesting, this is only possible when you're safe, when you have no existential threats. You can look inward, you can fight amongst yourselves, you can squabble, you can create sort of bizarre worldviews, etc. Only when times are really soft. And there's this whole notion of, soft times make hard to soft people make hard times, and so on, right? So we're in that situation, right, where we're living in relatively soft times. We have no real existential threats that we perceive, right? We actually have them. The Chinese are one, et cetera, and we have other existential threats. But this is only possible because we're so blessed to be so affluent and so protected.
Yeah. And the sad thing is, what often happens with decadence is you see poverty because the social system, because things are so wealthy, the system stops functioning and it gets hijacked for a small elite. And then you see normal people fall into being an underclass. That happened in the Roman Republic, where the Romans conquered the entire Mediterranean, and the Romans used to have a very strong middle class. And what ended up happening was that they started importing millions of slaves into Italy. And so small Roman farmers had to compete with plantations with thousands of slaves, and they just couldn't. And so they moved into the city. The government started giving out welfare, or panem et circus, or bread and circus.
Bread.
And so we've seen a similar thing where I'm from Pennsylvania, and I walked past what used to be the largest shipyard in the world on my way to school. And for 4 years, I did not see a single ship pass. And either import lots of cheap labor, or we globalize. And those are complicated things with both pros and cons. But a clear effect has been the devaluation of the average American worker. And so they support radical politics, because why would you vote for a centrist candidate if the centrist candidate's not going to do anything? There are loads of historic examples of way too fast population growth and that screwing up a society. A big reason World War I happened was that the average age in Europe was so insanely young that you had all these really aggressive 21-year-old guys. China in the 19th century had a series of really, really crippling wars because it was massively overpopulated. And over history, you see rhythmic cycles of population going up and down. And from all the metrics we're seeing right now, the world's population will probably go down by a significant metric over the next couple decades. And in general, when people stop having kids, when the average age of marriage goes above 28, it means that the upper limit of what that society is capable of dealing with has been reached. And the US has the most stable demographics of any country in the developed world. Our demographics are even better than a lot of countries like Brazil or Vietnam, or classic third world countries. And that's partially due to immigration. It's also partially, I had my researcher do a project on the factors that keep population growth high. And it's a combination of rural and religious populations. And so the US is a larger rural religious population, also we have big suburbs, and it's easier to have kids in large suburban homes than in small urban apartments, which is why countries like Germany, Italy, Japan have such low birth rates, because their populations are clustered inside cities with small apartments. And the US is in a good position relatively versus other societies because we have that stability. So China, Russia, much of Europe and Japan, etc., their populations are slated to halve over the next 60 years because there just are nowhere near enough children. And so the US will have aging problems, but it's nothing compared to what the rest of the developed world's going to have. And if we have a period of several decades to boost our birth rate so that we wouldn't hit a crisis at all. I'll stop on there before I move on to vigor. Does anyone have any questions?
No, go ahead. Go on to vigor.
Yeah, so it reminds me of a quote by Socrates, where Socrates said, "We as the Greeks have done so much to inure ourselves to be able to deal with physical pain, where we as the Greeks will fight across thousands of miles, will establish, will have all these suffering, but we don't have any way to deal with, we don't have any way as Greeks to deal with pleasure, where pleasure can just totally destroy us." And that was a big problem for ancient empires, where the Persians were a great example. They were a people who were able to just be incredible warriors. Persia was easily the best empire up to its point, the most humane, the best run, the best military. But within 2 generations, the Persian elite became completely decadent and they stopped being able to do anything. And then the Greeks conquered them. But across history, a couple different factors can allow you to maintain a sense of vigor, where Europe is the main area of the world that was wealthy for a long period of time, but then did not fall to decadence, where, for example, in Asian empires, you solidify the boundary, then you start recruiting tribesmen from the edge of the empire to fight for you. Those tribesmen seize power. But in Europe for several centuries, places like England, France, Germany, they were quite wealthy countries, but they had good militaries. And a big reason for that is that the constant competition of Europe, where these countries were always fighting each other. And I don't think we should constantly start wars, but that having a sense of internal competition is what can keep society strong. Where in America, one of our greatest advantages is that we can constantly shift out elites, where, for example, once the British nobility lost its effectiveness, the British Empire was dead. The Spanish were able to keep their power for 100 years because the medieval Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun said it takes around 100 to 200 years for an elite to become decadent. And in most empires, they don't last longer than that period. But in America, we've consistently been able to shift out elites because of our federal system. So the East Coast elite of the Revolution, they stopped being effective, so it switched to the antebellum South. The South, slavery was wrong, and the South stopped being able to pull it off. And so the Northern industries replaced it. Once the Northern industries and the Rust Belt lost competitivity, it switched to the coast, the people with college degrees in the coast. And then America is always able to move to a different part of the country, get a different group of people, because the thing that always kills civilizations is a single social class hijacking the entire civilization, as I said before. And in America, our greatest advantage is we have infinite competition between different elites. And so you need to make it so that our founders did a great job so that the government is incapable of co-opting the institutions of the society for a single faction.
It's supposed to be that, David. This goes back to what you and I were hitting on the inaugural episode, where we sort of introduced what the idea behind all of this was. And I think I said that the most amazing, miraculous thing, it's a miracle that the United States exists. This concept, this experiment exists at all, because the people who had the power to create the government and give themselves endless power chose to limit what the central power and the violence thereby that they can espouse on everyone else ever could have. And with 150,000 page tax code and numerous laws that I don't know when I'm breaking walking down the street, we no longer, I'm not sure we're at the spot where we're supposed to be. The fact is, the United States is still the cleanest, most transparent, most safe, the economic system, the financial system, the society itself, it is the best in the world.
Best imperfect
That doesn't
system.
mean it's good.
So
Doesn't mean it's not, it's as good as it should be.
Absolutely.
It is the cleanest shirt in the laundry.
And I have to say this is really important to me. I have always been very pessimistic about America and its longevity, et cetera. I started the America's Future series because I wanted to help forestall what I consider the inevitable end of America as the hegemon of the world, right? And I am encouraged when I talk to someone like Rudyard, because I don't know all the things he knows. And when he brings up some of the things that are actually in our favor, I feel better about it. I feel, okay, look, we do have a problem with centralized power, groups trying to take complete control. We have that problem in America. We see it all the time. But to his point, people are able to move around and groups compete with each other. And so
innovation is able to shift around.
But if you treat people badly, I'm not trying to get political here, they will leave California. They will say that system's not working, and I will go to Texas or Florida or whatever, right? For political reasons, sometimes for sociological, for religious, for whatever, but primarily for economic reasons, right? So there's been a migration in the United States, and it's a reaction to the sort of intense desire to keep great control, right? I hear things like this from Rudyard. And I hear people talk about China, who I was just assuming was going to take us over in 20 years. And he shakes his hand, which makes me happy when I see that, oh, maybe we're not all going to have to learn Chinese and be absorbed by the Borg, right? That resistance is futile and you will be assimilated. I do think they're pinky in the brain. I think China wakes up every day trying to figure out how to take over the world, just like Pinky in the Brain, the old cartoon, right? And they work at it really, really hard.
You're a little old for that cartoon, aren't you?
Yeah, and we spend a lot of time trying to figure out what to rename something or argue amongst ourselves and get in fights with them ourselves while they're building roads and stealing our capabilities. So I'm heartened though, if you ever watch Rudyard stuff on China, you'll go, oh yeah, they got some of their own problems too. They got some root cause issues. So I'll turn it back over to you, Rudyard, on that.
Yeah, Rudyard, the final thoughts here, if you will, like David's hitting on, give us, why is the United States going to survive and thrive in the next 20, 30, 50 years?
I think we'll dominate the world for the next couple hundred years. And the reason I say that is when you look at countries like China, Russia, our main rivals, India as well, is their cultures that don't really talk about their problems to the outside world. And so they are putting up the best facade they can. And we are competing up against the facade they put out, but we're a culture that shoves their shit everywhere. And we just don't see the problems they have. Or let's use China as an example. Their population is going to have over the next 60 years. They have a really corrupt, their real estate market is a quarter of their economy, and people will work 20 years, working 12 hours a day to buy a four-sided concrete shack with no electricity or water because the real estate market's that crazy. They have all sorts of bizarre legislations, like internal immigration is forbidden. You can't move out of your hometown legally in China. They sell political offices, and people look at China as if it's a unified power, but the reality, and I could talk about this all day, is it's split between all these factions in the Communist Party. And so lots of decisions get made that don't really make much sense because it's playing off some local faction. And I mean, I think China's gonna, I'd bet money that China has a revolution in the next within the next 10 years, and the Communist Party is gonna fall because they have their birth rate's a quarter of what it has to be stable because of just people can't afford to have
their population.
Yeah.
Just last month, right? The media widely reported that China's population for the first time in decades outright declined.
They've been lying with those numbers massively too. Like assume every stat in China's lied to at least 20%. And
boy, that's generous. 20%, man. Let's go 50.
That's at least. There are some areas.
There are some areas, yeah.
Their crime, their inequality, their birth rate, all those stats are way off. And so you have this giant cohort of people who are around age 38 where they can't afford to have kids. They're working 12-hour shifts and they just running out of energy. And yeah, it's just that demographic is screwed as it goes in the middle age, and they have no money to save for retirement.
And the United States, on the flip side?
We have similar problems, but not to the same degree. Is that fair?
U.S. has stable demographics. We're self-sufficient for almost every resource, like food, oil. We are reindustrializing extremely rapidly. The federal system means that we can move stuff if certain states can take up the slack if the others don't work. We're still the center of global innovation. I don't really see a single long-term factor that could hurt America, but there's loads that could hurt China. And
you know, the one thing that we don't have our own stable supply of is rare earth minerals. And I actually am invested in the only United States company that is making it so that we might have some rare earth minerals. But other than that, is there anything that we get from anywhere else that we couldn't supply ourselves?
yeah, I mean, it's the chips in our phone, but how much more time?
Taiwan. Yeah.
Well,
and
we're gonna
meanwhile,
wrap up,
Intel, by
but
the way, is
let's go another
investing
5 minutes or so.
billions of dollars into this.
There's a couple other factors I'm going to run through to talk about things that can weaken civilizations. One, in the biggest one, or that Spengler, Amaury de Riencourt, who are the biggest writers, is decline in traditional values, because a civilization is built around a certain code of values, but as it grows older, those values become out of sync with the world they exist in. And what ends up happening is that once your society loses values, you see the rise in Caesarism, where I made a video at the emotions that dominate societies. And in the Roman Empire and our current society, the dominant emotion is anxiety. People are trying to do what pleases other people, and they have no clear moral direction. And what's happened in every anxiety-based society, either pre-revolutionary France, Tsarist Russia, is a Caesar rises, because when I call it the lonely crowd from a book on the topic, everyone's in the crowd because they want approval, but they're lonely because they're not being authentic, as a Caesar rises up to assuage their worries. And I worry about America having Caesarism in the future. And the biggest thing is, if you want to see how societies work, just imagine how you get a group of 10 people to work together, because we often understand interpersonal relationships much better than politics, but politics is largely just a growth of it's lots of impersonal relations. So stuff like super high inequality, stuff like not having a shared set of values, political, like Spengler, who's a big historian, says societies are strong when they're all one people, but then they fall apart when a single city treats everything else like province, and all the rest of the country like Hicks or provinces. When that sense of centralized elitist power is when you know a society is not in a good place.
With that, I think we've got some really great commentary in here. David, do you have any final thoughts, and/or Ken?
Well, I want to thank Rudyard for being here. I want
Thank you,
everyone to
Rudyard.
look for two things. One, go to his podcast on YouTube. Check out the one on the emotions that drive societies. check out the one about marriage and the family structure and how that determines politics. Those are fascinating. All of these root cause things are things I think people need to understand so that we can understand where we're at, what drives us, and then what we can do about it. And then also join him. He's kicking off our National Security Dual Use Technology Summit as part of South by Southwest on March 10th. And you can go to afseries.com, check it out. Here's a code, AFS free, all caps, and you can come see it for free. Now I'd like Ken to wrap us up and give us his thoughts.
Rudyard, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, this has been really great for me. I wanted to say that as the sponsor, once again, Zero North Data, we protect and secure your data as it goes over the internet at rest and in transit. But one of the things that we like to do is protect that data to protect Americans. And so we're really excited to be part of this, and we can't wait to see Rudyard in person in Austin on the 10th.
Thank you.
Really
Peace,
appreciate
love,
all of you.
happiness. God bless.
Thank you, Cody.
Guys. Thank you. Thanks for David loving this. Appreciate it.
Loving it.
Ken,
you.
great job. Thank you. Rudyard,
All right,
thank you.
so we're
I'll get the
done,
name
and
pronounced correctly
he-
before the show's over.
The rudder. He's the rudder. He's what steers us in the right direction.
Rudyard,
Thank you, guys.
Okay.